All right, today we're going to be looking at the Enlightenment. So, we're going to discuss what that was, what were the key principles and ideas of this movement, and then we're going to look at how those principles are reflected in the works of specific Enlightenment philosophers. And just a heads up, there are tons of them. I'm not going to cover every single one today, but we're going to look at some of the biggest and the most influential. All right, so first of all, what was the Enlightenment? So this was a 17th plus 18th century intellectual movement that applied the principles of the scientific revolution in order to promote social progress. So really the key point here, right, is that it came a little bit after the scientific revolution and it emerged from the scientific revolution. So it was all about using sort of the tools and methods of the scientific revolution, but instead of looking at the natural world and the physical world, it was looking at things like human behavior and human society. So that's our first key principle there, right? Use of scientific methods like reason and empirical observation to solve political, economic, and social problems. And sort of implicit there is a belief that these problems could be solved. So Enlightenment philosophers tended to be very optimistic. They wanted to make the world a better place. They also believed that society and human behavior are governed by certain natural laws, just like the physical world. So they tried to understand, well, what were those natural laws? Can you apply these laws universally to all human behavior? They also had a belief that human beings hold natural rights that can't be taken away by governments. So they believed, again, very optimistic, right? They believed in political and religious freedom, and they believed that government is based on the consent of the governed. Oops, there's a typo there. And this idea, by the way, is called the social contract. And one of the things we're going to look at today is how this idea evolved over time during the Enlightenment. And by the way, if any of these ideas ring a bell, you're like, wait a minute, the United States, our government is based on an idea that it's based on an agreement by the consent of the governed. Yes, we were very much influenced by Enlightenment philosophy, as I am sure you guys know. All right, so the first Enlightenment philosopher we're going to take a look at is a guy named Thomas Hobbes, and as you can tell from the name, he is English. And the key text that he published is a book called Leviathan, and it's a work of political philosophy. And if you notice the date there, he was writing during and at the very end of the English Civil War, which really informed his views. So he had this I mentioned that Enlightenment philosophers tended to be pretty optimistic, not so much Hobbes, right? Because he's kind of beginning. He's at the very beginning of the movement, so he's a little bit different. So he had a very pessimistic view of human nature. He believed that humans are greedy and violent. And in a system without government, so what he called the state of nature, he believed that human beings would constantly be at war with one another because there was no government to restrain them, and that life would be poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And in response to this, he believed that the best form of government that would restrain these base impulses was actually an absolute monarchy. So again, he's kind of unique in that he's not really a proponent of political freedom here. But what's kind of interesting about Hobbes is that even though he's advocating for absolute monarchy, what makes him an Enlightenment philosopher is he believed that absolute monarchs gain their power not from God, not from divine right, but from the people. So he had this idea that human beings should make a social contract or an agreement with the monarch and then surrender all of their freedom to the government in exchange for protection, right? So he believed that basically we need someone super powerful to keep us in line because we're naturally greedy and violent. All right, so the next Enlightenment philosopher we're going to talk about is also English. He was interested in political philosophy, but he was also interested in all sorts of other fields of philosophy. But he's really best known as a political philosopher, I think. So unlike Hobbes, or actually, what's interesting about Locke is he definitely read Hobbes, but he has a very different take on kinds of similar topics. So his perspective on human nature is that human beings are neither good nor bad. He thought that human beings were born as a blank slate or a tabula rasa in Latin, and that we learn everything. So our knowledge of the world, but also our knowledge of morality and good and evil is learned as we grow up. So this is going to lead him to really favor providing education to lots of people, right? So especially early childhood education, because he thought you could sort of train people up to be better citizens and more knowledgeable people. Now, in terms of political philosophy, so definitely the historical context is going to shape his work, just like it shaped Hobbes's work. So whereas Hobbes was writing during the English Civil War, Locke is writing after the Glorious Revolution, right? So he's already seen a constitutional monarchy, so not an absolute monarchy, right, be successful and protect people's lives. So he's not quite as pessimistic or as big a proponent of an authoritarian government as Hobbes is. So Locke believed that human beings have the natural right to life, liberty, and property. And if that rings a bell, yes, Thomas Jefferson, very inspired by that, though you can see he changed it to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, Locke believed that the best form of government is a republic. So this is one, right, where people elect leaders to make policy for them, right? And he also had this idea of a social contract, but he changed it a little bit from Hobbes. So whereas Hobbes believed you should give up all of your freedom to an absolute monarch, Locke thought you should only give up some of your freedom, right, to a republican form of government in exchange for protection. Moreover, there's some obligations on the part of the government here as well, too, right? If the government fails to protect people's natural rights towards life, liberty, and property, people have the right to overthrow it. And if you don't want to read Locke, but you want to learn more about his political philosophy, just take a look at the Declaration of Independence, because again, Jefferson very much inspired. All right. So our third political philosopher that or one of the big three, right? The third of the big three is actually French, and his name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And again, interested in similar topics, but very different take. And Rousseau's actually going to kind of bridge us between the Enlightenment and a later intellectual movement, which is Romanticism, which you might know about from your English class. So Rousseau believed that his take on human nature was that in the state of nature, so in a situation in which there's no government, people are actually kind and virtuous. Now, he got this idea actually from what he thought was sort of like an empirical observation of reality. He read books about life in the New World. So he read, like, for example, Bartolome de las Casas, who we know portrayed Native Americans as very, like, kind and gentle, right? And so Rousseau thought that his work was grounded in reality. Though, as we know, de las Casas maybe exaggerated a little bit. So to make a point. So Rousseau's, that's kind of an interesting thing about Rousseau. But here's the twist, right? So even though human beings are naturally kind and virtuous, Rousseau thought something changed at some point in history. And this is when human beings discovered private property. So now that they have, land, they have stuff to own, that's when people start fighting, right? So he inspired a lot of sort of anti-capitalist philosophers as well. Now, Rousseau, kind of following from this, he thought that we could actually get back to some sort of more virtuous situation here. So he's, again, pretty optimistic, like a lot of our Enlightenment philosophers. And he believed that the best form of government, he actually went one step further than Locke, is a direct democracy in which everyone governs and makes laws together. So they don't even need to vote for people to represent them. They could just make policy together. And he thought that you're like, okay, well, I see a contradiction here. So he's saying on the one hand that human beings become corrupt when you introduce private property. How are they supposed to govern themselves? And Rousseau's answer would be, aha, very similar to Locke, education. So Rousseau, also a huge proponent of education, and he believed that people could be raised to become virtuous citizens. But there's a catch. Only men. Also, just a fun fact about Rousseau, he was a parent. He abandoned all his children in an orphanage, yet had very strong ideas about parenting, so make of that what you will. All right. Now, our next philosopher is actually really interesting because she responded to Rousseau. And she was also interested, again, same topics, but she had this idea. She goes, Rousseau, hold on. You're telling me that only men can be virtuous citizens because women lack the capacity for reason. She's like, hold on here. How do you know that women lack the capacity for reason? What if they just haven't had access to the same kinds of educational opportunity as men? And that you could teach women how to be reasonable, right? So that was her position here. She was also very similar to Locke, and actually a little bit of Rousseau. She was also a big proponent of political freedom. So she advocated for a republican form of government like Locke in a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Men. And by the way, that book where she talked about the rights of women, it's called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. So good at very representative titles there. All right. Now we're going to look at another political philosopher, this time also French. And you're also going to see some echoes in American government here as well. So this is the Baron de Montesquieu, and that's his title, not his name. I don't actually know what his name was. And the book that he wrote was called On the Spirit of the Laws. And what he did is he observed and classified forms of government and social classes and believed that governments behave according to natural laws. So again, he's a great example of applying those methods and principles of the scientific revolution to looking at governments and society. Right? And more than that, he also had some opinions, not just about sort of, straight up just observing what was there in reality, but he had some beliefs about how to organize government too. And he believed that the best way to ensure liberty and freedom was a government based on this principle called separation of powers, which should also ring a bell from 8th grade. And this is the idea that you should separate government into the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. So a branch that enforces law, a branch that makes law, and a branch that interprets law. And moreover, he thought that in addition to this, you needed to give those branches the ability to check and balance one another. So all these branches had the ability to limit the power of the other, so the government as a whole did not become too powerful. All right. And now we're going to look at another French philosopher here. You can see English, French, really big. Mary Wollstonecraft, by the way, also English. So that's really going to be the center of the Enlightenment, France and England and Scotland a little bit too. And Voltaire is interesting because he kind of departs from some of what our other philosophers did. So in keeping with themes of the Enlightenment, he was a big proponent of religious toleration, and he really critiqued the corruption of the Catholic Church, which, as you know, is still dominant in France, right? He was also a really strong proponent of freedom of speech and thought, and this actually led him to get in a lot of trouble. He ended up kind of getting kicked out of France and wandering all over Europe, and he was buddies with the King of Prussia, who we'll talk about next time. But interestingly enough, Voltaire, even though he was a critic of absolute monarchy, he wasn't like some of the other later Enlightenment philosophers in that he believed in democracy and republicanism as well. He thought people were really stupid and weren't quite capable of governing themselves. He was also kind of critical of other Enlightenment philosophers' optimism. He believed that you couldn't necessarily use reason to solve every single problem. All right. So those are some philosophers who are really interested in religion and society and government. Now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a philosopher who's interested in economics, and he's really going to be our first economist, right? So he's founding a branch of social science. So he is a scientist, right? And his key book is called The Wealth of Nations. And by the way, Adam Smith is, don't quote me on this. He's English or Scottish. I'm going to have to double check on that. And Adam Smith, his big innovation was that he was really critical of mercantilism and government involvement in the economy. And instead, he argued that we should have something called laissez-faire economics, which is the idea that economies work best when the government stays out of the economy, and prices are set by interaction between consumers and suppliers in a free market. So the idea here, right, is if there's two competing cupcake stores, right, and one cupcake store is much better, it's much more delicious, consumers are going to vote with their wallets and they are going to purchase more of the better tasting cupcakes. So they're going to go to that store, they're going to spend their money at that store, the bad cupcake store will close, and then the big cupcake store will have enough profits to expand and found a new cupcake store. So the benefit here, right, is that everyone has better cupcakes, right? And Adam Smith also kind of had perspectives on human nature. He believed, kind of like Hobbes, that people are motivated by greed and self-interest, but he didn't really think this was a bad thing, right? He's like, that's just natural, and the free market is awesome because it harnesses that greed and uses it to benefit other people, right? So going back to my crummy cupcake store example, right? The owner of that really good cupcake store, they're not motivated by this humanitarian belief in providing great cupcakes to everybody. They're motivated by a desire to make money, right? So that leads them to improve and innovate and make better and better and better cupcakes, right? All right, so now to close our lesson today, we're going to talk about how these Enlightenment ideas spread. So Enlightenment ideas, they really only appeal to the aristocracy and the upper middle class. So as you guys know, right, not everyone in Europe can read. Not everyone in Europe is literate. That is expanding. We're seeing increased access to public education after the Reformation. But still, like, if you're a French peasant work in the fields, you're probably not literate, and then you probably just don't have the time or the interest to sit down and read Rousseau, right? You've got a life to live. So interest in the Enlightenment was really only limited to the upper classes, right, as well as the upper middle class here. But that's not to say like these ideas didn't spread. They did. And a lot of it was discussion in new kinds of public gathering spaces, like the salon, which you guys are actually going to simulate very soon. As well as coffee houses and cafes and reading clubs and libraries and organized societies, like some of those scientific and philosophical societies we saw emerge during the Scientific Revolution, as well as Masonic lodges.